The wind had been howling for an hour when Elijah Zimmerman heard the voice rising above the storm, clear and trembling like a bell in a church tower. He'd taken shelter in an abandoned homestead 3 miles outside Snowflake, Arizona, and he'd thought himself alone until that hymn reached his ears through the wooden walls. The year was 1881, and spring storms in the high desert could turn vicious without warning, bringing rain that felt like needles and thunder that shook the earth. Elijah pressed his ear to the interior door and listened, his heart suddenly beating faster than it had any right to. The voice was female, young and scared. She was singing Rock of Ages with a determination that spoke of someone trying to hold herself together by sheer force of will. Elijah had been raised by a God-fearing mother who taught him every hymn in the Baptist hymnal before she passed, and the words came back to him now like old friends. He pushed open the door slowly, not wanting to startle whoever was inside, and found her in the corner of what had once been a bedroom. She was maybe 22 or 23, with dark auburn hair falling loose from its pins and eyes the color of spring grass. Her dress was dusty and torn at the hem, and she clutched a worn leather Bible to her chest like a shield. When she saw him, she stopped singing mid-verse, her mouth forming a small O of surprise. "Don't stop on my account," Elijah said gently, removing his hat. He was 25, tall and lean from years of working cattle, with dark hair and eyes that his friends said were too serious for a man his age. "That's a good hymn for a storm." "I didn't know anyone else was here," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I heard the thunder and I got scared." "Singing helps. My mama used to say the same thing." Elijah stayed near the doorway, giving her space. "I'm Elijah Zimmerman. I work the Morrison Ranch about 10 miles east of here. Got caught in the storm on my way back from Holbrook." "Theresa Prescott," she said, relaxing just a fraction. "Everyone calls me Tessa. I was traveling to Snowflake to meet my cousin, but my horse spooked when the lightning started. She threw me and ran off, and I found this place just before the rain really started coming down." Another crack of thunder shook the homestead, and Tessa flinched, her knuckles going white on the Bible. Without thinking, Elijah started singing where she'd left off, his baritone voice steady and strong. "Rock of Ages, cleft for me, let me hide myself in thee." Tessa's eyes widened, and then, slowly, she joined him. Their voices blended together in the small room, hers high and sweet, his low and resonant. They sang through the first verse and into the second, and Elijah felt something shift in the air between them, something that had nothing to do with the storm outside and everything to do with the way she was looking at him now. When they finished the hymn, the silence felt different, less frightening. The rain still pounded on the roof and the wind still howled, but inside their shelter something warm had taken root. "That was beautiful," Tessa said softly. "I haven't heard anyone sing like that since my father passed 2 years ago." "I'm sorry for your loss," Elijah said, meaning it. He moved a little closer, settling down with his back against the wall opposite her. "Where are you traveling from?" "Santa Fe." "My mother remarried last year, and her new husband made it clear there wasn't room for me in their home anymore." Tessa's voice was matter of fact, but Elijah could hear the hurt underneath. "My cousin Martha wrote that she and her husband needed help with their children and their ranch. It seemed like a good opportunity for a fresh start." "Snowflake's a good town," Elijah said. "Mormon settlement mostly, but they're welcoming to outsiders if you're willing to work hard and keep the peace. The land's tough but beautiful. High desert, pine forests up in the mountains. Different from Santa Fe, but good in its own way." Lightning flashed through the gaps in the boarded windows, and Tessa's breath hitched. Elijah saw fear flash across her face, raw and real. "My father died in a storm," she said quietly. Lightning struck the barn where he was working. I've been afraid of them ever since. Then we'll keep singing, Elijah said firmly. What's your favorite hymn, How Great Thou Art? Tessa said without hesitation. I don't know that one as well, but I'll follow your lead. Tessa smiled, and it transformed her face from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. She started singing, her voice gaining confidence with each word, and Elijah joined in when he could, humming the melody when he didn't know the lyrics. The storm raged on outside, but inside the abandoned homestead, they created their own small sanctuary of music and faith. They sang through Amazing Grace and What a Friend We Have in Jesus, through Blessed Assurance and It Is Well With My Soul. Between hymns, they talked. Elijah told her about growing up in Texas, about coming to Arizona Territory 5 years ago looking for work and finding a home instead. He told her about the Morrison Ranch, how the old man who owned it treated his cowboys like family, how he'd saved up enough money to think about buying his own small piece of land someday. Tessa told him about her childhood in Santa Fe, about her father who'd been a carpenter and her mother who'd seemed to shrink after his death, becoming someone Tessa barely recognized. She told him about the long journey to Arizona, about the hope and fear warring in her chest as she got closer to Snowflake, and the unknown future that awaited her there. You think your cousin will be worried? Elijah asked after they'd sung through another verse of Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. I was supposed to arrive yesterday, Tessa said, biting her lip. But one of the wagon wheels broke 2 days out, and by the time we got it fixed, I'd missed the stage connection in Hallbrook. I sent a telegram, but I don't know if she received it. She's probably frantic by now. The storm will pass soon, Elijah said, listening to the rain. It was still heavy, but the thunder was growing more distant. Another hour, maybe 2. When it does, we'll find your horse or get you to Snowflake on mine. Either way, you'll be with your family before nightfall. You're kind to help me, Tessa said, meeting his eyes. Not every man would be. My mama raised me right, Elijah said simply. Besides, I don't think I've enjoyed a storm this much in my whole life. Tessa laughed, a real laugh that made her eyes crinkle at the corners. That's a strange thing to say. Strange but true. Elijah felt his own mouth curving into a smile. I've never had anyone to sing with before. My mama died when I was 16, and I haven't sung much since then. Forgot how good it feels. Then we should sing some more, Tessa said, and there was something in her voice that made Elijah's heart skip. Before the storm ends. They sang in the sweet by and by, and softly and tenderly, their voices finding harmonies that seemed to have always existed, just waiting for them to discover. The rain began to slow, becoming a steady patter instead of a deluge, and the light through the cracks in the walls shifted from storm dark to the golden glow of late afternoon sun breaking through clouds. I think it's passing, Tessa said, and Elijah heard both relief and something like regret in her voice. I think you're right. Elijah stood, stretching his long legs, and offered Tessa his hand. She took it, and the touch sent warmth shooting up his arm. Her hand was small and rough with calluses, the hand of someone who'd worked hard all her life. He liked that about her. They walked outside together, still holding hands, and found the world washed clean. The desert stretched out around them in shades of red and gold, dotted with juniper and sage, and to the north, the mountains rose up purple and magnificent against a sky that was clearing to brilliant blue. The air smelled of rain and earth and possibility. It's beautiful, Tessa breathed. I've never seen anything quite like it. Wait until you see the sunset, Elijah said. The sky turns colors that don't seem real. They found Tessa's horse about a quarter mile away, calmly grazing on new grass as if she hadn't run off and stranded her rider in a storm. Elijah's own mount, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Sam, had weathered the storm tied under an overhang and seemed pleased to see his master. "Will you ride with me to Snowflake?" Elijah asked as he checked Sam's cinch. "I'd like to make sure you get there safely." "I'd like that very much," Tessa said, and the way she looked at him made Elijah feel like he could rope the sun and pull it down from the sky. They rode together as the afternoon stretched into evening, talking and laughing like old friends. Elijah told her stories about ranch life, about ornery cattle and wilder horses, about nights sleeping under the stars and mornings so cold your breath froze in the air. Tessa told him about her dreams, about wanting to teach children someday, about the books she loved to read and the garden she wanted to grow. Snowflake appeared on the horizon as the sun was beginning its descent, a cluster of neat adobe and wooden buildings arranged along wide streets. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Elijah could see people moving about, finishing their daily chores before supper. "Martha lives on the east side of town," Tessa said, her voice tight with nervousness. "At least, that's what her letter said." They asked directions from a man carrying buckets of water to his livestock, and he pointed them toward a well-kept house with a large barn and corrals. Before they reached it, the front door flew open and a woman came running out, her skirts flying. Tessa. Oh, thank the Lord. Martha Kimball was a few years older than Tessa, plump and pretty with kind eyes and flower in her hair. She grabbed her cousin and hugged her tight, crying and scolding at the same time. "We were so worried. The telegram said you'd be here this afternoon, and when the storm came through I thought the worst. Are you hurt? Where have you been?" "I'm fine, Martha, truly." Tessa extracted herself from her cousin's embrace and gestured to Elijah, who had dismounted and stood holding both horses. "My horse spooked in the storm and threw me. I took shelter in an old homestead, and Elijah here found me and made sure I got to you safely." Martha turned her attention to Elijah, her eyes sharp and assessing in the way of women who have been charged with protecting their own. "Elijah Zimmerman, madam," he said, tipping his hat. "I work the Morrison Ranch east of here. I'm glad I could help." "Morrison Ranch," Martha repeated, and her expression softened. "I know Jack Morrison. Good man, fair employer. Thank you for taking care of my cousin, Mr. Zimmerman. Will you stay for supper? It's the least we can do." Elijah glanced at Tessa, who was looking at him with those green eyes full of something he wanted very much to believe was hope. "I'd be honored, madam." Supper was a lively affair. Martha's husband, Thomas, was a quiet, solid man who clearly adored his wife. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, who were fascinated by Elijah and peppered him with questions about cowboy life. Through it all, Elijah found himself watching Tessa, noting the way she helped Martha serve the food, the gentle way she spoke to the children, the sound of her laugh when Thomas told a joke. After the meal, Martha shooed everyone out of the kitchen so she and Tessa could clean up, and Thomas invited Elijah to sit on the porch with him. They smoked in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. "You're smitten with her," Thomas said finally, his voice matter of fact. Elijah didn't bother denying it. "Yes, sir, I believe I am. She's had a hard time of it from what Martha tells me. Her mother's new husband is a cruel man. Tessa needs kindness and stability." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" Thomas looked at him directly. "Cowboy wages aren't much. Martha and I can offer Tessa a home here, work that pays, a chance to save money and build a life. Can you offer her more than that?" Elijah thought about his savings, carefully accumulated over 5 years. He thought about the piece of land he'd had his eye on, 50 acres of good grazing land with a creek running through it, and a view of the mountains. He thought about the plans he'd been making in his head, vague and formless, until now, suddenly crystallizing into something real and urgent. "Not yet," he said honestly, "but I'm working on it. I've been saving to buy land of my own. I have enough for the down payment, and Jack Morrison said he'd stake me for the rest if I needed it. I was planning to wait another year or two, but—" He trailed off, not sure how to put into words the feeling that had taken hold of him in that abandoned homestead, the certainty that he'd found something precious and rare. Thomas nodded slowly. "Martha and I met during a storm, too. She was helping a neighbor birth a calf, and I was passing through looking for work. That was 12 years ago, and I've never regretted a single day." He stood, stretching. "Come back tomorrow evening if you're able, Mr. Zimmerman. I have a feeling Tessa would like to see you again." Elijah did come back the next evening, and the evening after that, and the evening after that. He came on Sunday to escort Tessa and the Kimball family to church, where their voices blended together in the hymns and people turned to listen, smiling. He came on Wednesday with wildflowers he'd picked on his lunch break, making Tessa blush and Martha hide a knowing smile. He came on Friday with a book of poetry he'd borrowed from Jack Morrison's wife, because Tessa had mentioned loving poetry, and he wanted to see her eyes light up. They courted properly, always with Martha or Thomas nearby, but the connection between them grew stronger with each meeting. Elijah told her about his plans for the land, and Tessa listened with shining eyes, adding her own ideas about where the house should sit and how big the garden should be. They sang together on Martha's porch while the children played in the yard and the sun set over the desert. They talked about everything and nothing, discovering shared dreams and complementary differences. 6 weeks after the storm, Elijah rode out to the land he'd been eyeing and made an offer. The owner, an older rancher who was moving back east to live with his daughter, accepted on the spot. 2 days later, with Jack Morrison and Thomas Kimball as witnesses, Elijah signed the papers that made him a landowner. That evening, he came to the Kimball house with his heart in his throat and asked Thomas for permission to marry Tessa. Thomas gave his blessing with a firm handshake and a genuine smile. Then Elijah asked Tessa herself, kneeling in Martha's parlor with his hat in his hands and his heart in his eyes. "Theresa Prescott, I know we haven't known each other long, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. You're the kindest, strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever met, and I can't imagine my future without you in it. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tessa was crying, but she was smiling too, and when she said, "Yes, Elijah Zimmerman, yes, with all my heart," he stood and swept her into his arms, kissing her while Martha cried happy tears and Thomas chuckled and the children cheered. They were married 4 weeks later in the church, where they'd first sung together as a couple. The whole town turned out for the wedding, it seemed, with people from the Morrison Ranch and the Kimball's friends and neighbors Elijah had made in his years in Arizona. Tessa wore a dress that Martha had helped her make, simple white cotton with lace at the collar, and she looked like an angel. When they exchanged vows, their voices were steady and sure, and when the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Elijah kissed his bride with a joy that made his chest feel too small to contain it. They spent their wedding night in a room at Snowflake's small hotel, shy and eager with each other, learning the language of touch and whispered endearments. In the morning, they rode out to their land together, and Elijah showed Tessa where he wanted to build their house. "Right here," he said, standing on a small rise that overlooked the creek, "so you can see the mountains from the kitchen window." "It's perfect," Tessa said, slipping her hand into his. "When can we start building?" "Next week. Jack's giving me time off and Thomas said he'd help. We'll have the frame up before summer hits hard." They built their house together that spring and early summer of 1881, with help from friends and neighbors who showed up with tools and strong backs and willing spirits. The house was small but well made, 2 rooms to start with space to add more later. Tessa planted a garden that first week, working the hard desert soil until it yielded, adding water from the creek and seeds she'd bought in town. She sang while she worked, hymns and folk songs and melodies she made up on the spot, and Elijah would stop whatever he was doing just to listen. They settled into married life with an ease that surprised them both. Elijah continued working at the Morrison Ranch while building up his own small herd, and Tessa made their house a home, cooking and cleaning and tending her garden. In the evenings, they sat on their porch and watched the sunset, singing together as the sky turned colors that still didn't seem quite real. The first year of their marriage brought challenges. A dry summer tested their water supply, and they spent long days hauling water from the creek to keep the garden and livestock alive. A hard winter brought snow to the high desert, more than usual, and they huddled close to their fireplace for warmth. But through it all, they had each other, and that made everything bearable. They had their first real fight in the spring of 1882, over something Elijah couldn't even remember later. It was silly and small, but they were both tired and stressed from calving season, and small things felt big. Tessa cried and Elijah stormed out, riding to cool his temper. He came back an hour later, ashamed and sorry, to find Tessa sitting on the porch singing "It Is Well With My Soul" with tears streaming down her face. He dismounted and sat beside her, and without speaking, he joined in the song. They sang through it twice, and by the end, they were holding hands and crying and laughing all at once. They apologized to each other and promised to do better, and they kept that promise. From then on, whenever tension rose between them, one of them would start singing and the other would join in, and somehow the music always helped them find their way back to each other. In the summer of 1882, Tessa realized she was pregnant. She told Elijah at sunset, while they sat on their porch and watched the sky turn gold and crimson. Elijah whooped with joy and picked her up, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to stop. That night, they lay in bed and talked about names and dreams, about the child they would raise together and the life they would build. Their son was born in March of 1883, during a spring storm that reminded them both of the day they met. Tessa labored through the thunder and lightning with Martha at her side and Elijah pacing outside, praying harder than he'd ever prayed in his life. When the baby finally came, squalling and red-faced and perfect, Elijah held him with shaking hands and tears running down his face. "What should we name him?" Tessa asked, exhausted but glowing. "I was thinking Samuel," Elijah said. "After my horse that got us through that first storm, Sam for short." Tessa laughed weakly. "Named after a horse, he'll love that story when he's older." Samuel Zimmerman grew up strong and healthy, with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. He learned to walk holding onto the porch railing while his parents sang, and his first words were "Mama" and "Papa," and then, surprisingly, "Sing." They did sing to him, every night before bed and every morning when he woke, filling his childhood with music and love. Elijah's herd grew slowly but steadily. He was careful and smart, buying cattle when prices were low and selling when they were high, reinvesting profits into more land and better stock. By 1885, he had 100 acres and 50 head of cattle, enough to support his family comfortably. He built an addition onto their house, adding a proper bedroom for Samuel and a small room that Tessa used for sewing and, increasingly, for teaching. Word had spread about Tessa's education and her way with children, and mothers in Snowflake started bringing their daughters to her for lessons in reading and writing. Tessa charged almost nothing, just enough to cover the cost of books and supplies, but she loved the work. Watching her with her students, seeing her patience and kindness, and the joy she took in their progress, made Elijah fall in love with her all over again. In 1886, they had a second child, a daughter they named Elizabeth after Elijah's mother. Elizabeth was quieter than Samuel, contemplative and sweet, and she had a voice that was pure and clear as a bell. By the time she was 3 years old, she could sing harmony to her parents' melody, and the Zimmerman family became known throughout the area for their music. They sang at church every Sunday, their voices blending in perfect harmony. They sang at community gatherings and weddings and barn raisings. They sang while they worked, while they cooked and cleaned and tended the animals. Music was woven through every part of their lives, a thread that connected them to each other, and to the day they'd met. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and songs. Samuel grew tall and strong, learning ranching from his father and developing a gift with horses that everyone remarked on. Elizabeth became her mother's helper, first with the garden and household chores, then with teaching. She had a natural gift for making complicated things simple, for reaching children others had given up on. In 1890, Elijah and Tessa celebrated their 9th wedding anniversary by taking a rare trip away from the ranch. Martha and Thomas watched the children, and Elijah and Tessa rode up into the mountains, to a place Elijah had found years ago but never shown anyone. It was a meadow high in the pines, with a view that stretched for miles and a creek that sang over smooth stones. They made camp and spent 2 days doing nothing but being together, talking and laughing and making love under the stars. On the second evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in its familiar, magnificent colors, Tessa turned to Elijah with tears in her eyes. "What's wrong?" he asked, immediately concerned. "Nothing's wrong," she said, smiling through her tears. "I'm just so happy. Sometimes I think about that scared girl in the abandoned homestead, alone in the storm and terrified, and I can barely recognize her. You've given me such a beautiful life, Elijah." "We've given each other a beautiful life," Elijah corrected gently. "I was just drifting before I met you, working and saving without really knowing what I was saving for. You gave me purpose. You gave me a home." They held each other as the stars came out, and Tessa started singing Rock of Ages, the hymn that had brought them together. Elijah joined in, his voice as strong and steady as it had been that first day, and their harmony drifted across the meadow and into the pines, a testament to love and faith, and the storms they'd weathered together. They had one more child, a son born in 1891 that they named Thomas after Tessa's cousin's husband, who had become one of Elijah's closest friends. Thomas was a surprise, arriving when Elizabeth was already 5 and Samuel nearly 8, but he was a welcome one. He was a joyful baby who laughed more than he cried, and he filled their home with even more light. By 1895, the Zimmerman Ranch was one of the most successful small operations in the area. Elijah had 200 acres now and 150 head of cattle, plus a string of horses that Samuel was training to sell. Tessa's teaching had grown into a proper school, with a dozen students coming 3 days a week to learn in the addition. Elijah had built onto their house specifically for that purpose. Samuel was now 12, Elizabeth 9, and Thomas 4, and they were a close-knit family who did everything together. They worked together on the ranch, with even little Thomas having chores he was responsible for. They ate together every evening, sharing stories about their days. And they sang together, always sang together, keeping alive the tradition that had started in a storm 15 years before. One evening, in late spring of 1896, a storm rolled in much like the one that had brought Elijah and Tessa together. The children were nervous, even Samuel, who usually acted braver than he felt, and Thomas was outright scared, clinging to Tessa's skirts. Elijah looked at Tessa and saw the same fear in her eyes that had been there that day in the abandoned homestead, the shadow of old grief and trauma. But he also saw strength and love and trust. She nodded at him, and he knew what to do. "Come on, family," he said, gathering them all in the parlor. "Let's sing until the storm passes." They started with Rock of Ages, of course, all 5 voices blending together in a harmony that was richer and fuller than anything Elijah and Tessa had created alone. They sang through the thunder and the lightning, through the pounding rain and howling wind. They sang every hymn they knew and then started over again, and by the time the storm passed, the children were smiling and Thomas had fallen asleep in Tessa's lap. "Tell us about how you met," Elizabeth said, as she always did after storms. She never got tired of the story. So Elijah and Tessa told it again, taking turns, adding details they'd remembered or emphasizing parts that seemed particularly meaningful. They told about the fear and the faith, about the moment their voices had joined together and created something stronger than either of them alone. They told about falling in love with hymns and hope, about building a life from nothing but determination and devotion to each other. "And that's why we always sing through storms," Tessa finished, stroking Elizabeth's hair. "Because singing brought your father and me together, and it's seen us through every hard thing since then." "I want to meet someone in a storm," Elizabeth declared. "When I'm grown up, I mean." "I just want to meet someone nice," Samuel said pragmatically, making everyone laugh. The years continued to pass in their steady rhythm. Samuel turned 18 in 1901 and started courting a girl from town, a sweet-natured rancher's daughter named Mary who loved music as much as the Zimmermans did. Elizabeth at 15 was already helping her mother teach full-time and talking about opening a proper school in Snowflake. Thomas was 10 and showing signs of being both a natural cowboy like his father and a scholar like his mother, equally comfortable on horseback or with his nose in a book. Elijah was 45 now, his dark hair showing threads of gray, his face lined from years in the sun. Tessa was 42, her auburn hair fading to auburn and silver, her hands rough from work but gentle in their touch. They had built something real and lasting, a legacy that went beyond land and cattle to encompass the family they'd raised and the community they'd helped build. In the spring of 1902, Samuel married Mary in the same church where Elijah and Tessa had wed 21 years before. The whole family sang at the wedding, their voices raised in joyful celebration. And when Samuel and Mary exchanged vows, Elijah squeezed Tessa's hand and remembered his own wedding day, how nervous and excited and certain he'd been. "Our boy is married," Tessa whispered, tears streaming down her face. "He chose well," Elijah whispered back. "She'll be good for him." Samuel and Mary built a house on a corner of the Zimmerman land, starting their own herd with cattle Elijah gifted them. Mary turned out to be everything they'd hoped for their son, kind and hardworking and deeply in love with Samuel. And when she got pregnant 6 months after the wedding, the whole family rejoiced. Elijah and Tessa became grandparents in early 1903. To a grandson, they encouraged Samuel and Mary to name whatever they wished. They named him James, and he had Samuel's dark hair and Mary's blue eyes and a set of lungs that could wake the whole ranch when he was hungry. Holding his grandson for the first time, Elijah felt emotion swell in his chest so large he thought he might burst with it. "Thank you," he said to Tessa that night, lying in their bed in the darkness. "For what?" she asked, snuggling closer. for everything. For saying yes when I asked you to marry me, for building this life with me, for these children and now this grandchild, for every song we've ever sung together." Tessa was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Do you remember what I said that first day in the homestead? That singing helped calm my fear, I remember. I haven't been afraid of storms since the day we married," Tessa said softly. "Because you're with me, and together we can weather anything. You've given me courage, Elijah. You've given me a life beyond anything I dreamed possible." They held each other in the darkness, listening to the familiar sounds of their ranch settling for the night, the distant lowing of cattle, and the closer sounds of their children sleeping safely in their rooms. And quietly, so quietly it was barely more than a breath, they sang together, their voices blending in the darkness like they'd been blending for more than 20 years. Elizabeth left for normal school in 1904, determined to get her teaching certificate and open the proper school she'd been planning for years. She wrote home every week, long letters full of her studies and her plans and her dreams. Tessa saved every letter, treasuring the evidence of her daughter's growth and ambition. Thomas at 13 was becoming a fine young man, serious and thoughtful like his father, creative and kind like his mother. He helped Elijah run the ranch now, taking on more responsibility every year, and he still sang with his parents every evening, his voice deepening into a rich baritone that perfectly complemented their harmony. In 1906, Samuel and Mary had a second child, a daughter named Rose. Elizabeth came home from normal school with her certificate and immediately began organizing her school, using money she'd saved from teaching to buy books and supplies. And Thomas, at 15, announced that he wanted to study animal husbandry at the Territorial College, to learn new methods that could help the ranch thrive. Elijah and Tessa found themselves entering a new phase of life, one where their children were grown or growing, pursuing their own dreams while still remaining close to home and family. It was bittersweet, watching them spread their wings, but mostly it was simply sweet. They had raised good people who were making their own marks on the world, and that was everything they could have hoped for. On a June evening in 1906, 25 years to the day after they'd met in that abandoned homestead, Elijah took Tessa back to the place where it had all started. The homestead was even more dilapidated now, its roof mostly caved in and its walls leaning dangerously, but the bones of it remained. They stood in what had been the bedroom where Tessa had huddled with her Bible, where Elijah had first heard her singing. "I can still hear it," Elijah said softly. "Your voice rising above the storm, scared but determined. It's the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard." "And I can still hear you joining in," Tessa replied, leaning against him, "making me feel less alone, giving me courage I didn't know I had." "Should we sing?" Elijah asked. "I think we should." They sang Rock of Ages there in the ruins of the homestead, their voices older now but still strong, still blending in perfect harmony. They sang it through twice, and then they sang How Great Thou Art and Amazing Grace and every hymn that held special meaning for them. They sang as the sun set and painted the sky in impossible colors, as the first stars began to appear in the darkening blue. When they finished, Tessa turned to Elijah with tears in her eyes. "These have been the best 25 years of my life." "Mine too," Elijah said, kissing her forehead. "And we have so many more ahead of us." They rode home together in the twilight, hand in hand, their voices rising in song over the desert they'd made their home. At their ranch, lights glowed in windows, Thomas waiting for them and Samuel's family nearby and Elizabeth in town working on her dream. Everything they'd built, everything they'd become, had started with a storm and a song and the courage to reach out to a stranger, The years that followed were good ones. Thomas did go to college, studying hard and coming home with new ideas that helped modernize the ranch. Elizabeth opened her school in 1908, and it quickly became the best in the area, known for its excellent education and the music program that every student participated in. Samuel and Mary had a third child, another son, in 1909, and the ranch rang with the sounds of grandchildren playing and learning and growing. Elijah and Tessa grew older gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. They still sang together every day, though their voices weren't as strong as they'd once been. They still watched the sunset from their porch every evening they could, marveling at the beauty of the land they'd built their life on. They still weathered storms together, literal and metaphorical, their faith in each other and in God seeing them through. In 1916, Samuel took over the day-to-day running of the ranch, with Thomas as his partner. Elijah was 60 now, and while he was still strong and healthy, he was ready to step back and let the next generation lead. He and Tessa spent more time traveling, visiting Elizabeth in town and spoiling their grandchildren, taking trips up into the mountains to the meadow that was their special place. They also spent more time simply being together, talking about everything and nothing, remembering the years behind them and dreaming about the years ahead. They had 7 grandchildren now, with more likely on the way, and the Zimmerman name was respected throughout the territory. The ranch was prosperous, Elizabeth's school was thriving, and all their children were happy and settled. It was more than they'd ever dared hope for. On a spring evening in 1921, 40 years after they'd met, another storm rolled through. Elijah was 65 now, Tessa 62, and they sat together on their porch watching the lightning flash and listening to the thunder roll. Inside the house, Thomas and his new wife were making dinner, filling the air with the smells of cooking and the sounds of laughter. "You remember?" Tessa asked, as she always did during storms. "Every detail," Elijah replied, as he always did. "Your voice singing, your green eyes scared but brave, the way you looked at me when I started singing too." "I knew then," Tessa said softly. "Even though I told myself I was being foolish, I knew you were going to be important to me. I felt it in my bones." "I knew too," Elijah admitted. "Scared me half to death feeling that much for someone I just met, but I've never doubted it, not for a single moment in 40 years. "Should we sing?" Tessa asked, and Elijah heard the girl she'd been in her voice, the one who'd used music to push back fear. "Always," he said. They sang Rock of Ages as the storm raged around them, their voices thin now with age but still harmonizing perfectly, still creating something beautiful together. They sang through the thunder and the lightning, through the rain that swept across their land and nourished everything growing there. They sang until the storm passed and the sky began to clear, revealing stars that seemed impossibly bright. Thomas came out to join them, bringing blankets against the cooling evening air. "You too and your storms," he said affectionately, draping the blankets around their shoulders. "I don't think I've ever seen a storm you didn't sing through." "Storms brought us together," Tessa said simply. "They're precious to us." "Tell me the story again," Thomas said, settling on the porch steps like he had as a child. "About how you met." So they told it again, the story that had become legend in their family, the tale of a cowboy and a scared girl and hymns sung in an abandoned homestead. They told it with all the love and joy and gratitude of 40 years of marriage, and when they finished, Thomas had tears in his eyes. "That's the kind of love I want," he said quietly. "The kind you two have, the kind that lasts." "Then choose wisely and love well," Elijah said. "And never stop singing even when things get hard, especially when things get hard." The years continued their steady march, bringing changes and constants in equal measure. Elijah and Tessa celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1931, surrounded by their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. The territory had become a state nearly 20 years before, and the ranch had grown with it, now encompassing 500 acres and supporting 3 generations of Zimmermans. They stood together at the celebration, still holding hands after 50 years, and sang with their family surrounding them. Dozens of voices joined in the hymns that had sustained them through 5 decades of marriage, and the sound was glorious, a testament to the power of faith and love and music. Elijah died peacefully in his sleep in 1935, at the age of 79. His last evening was spent on the porch with Tessa, watching the sunset and singing softly together, their voices blending one last time in perfect harmony. When Tessa woke the next morning to find him gone, she held him and cried, singing Rock of Ages through her tears, knowing he would have wanted music to mark his passing. But Tessa didn't mourn long in sorrow. She mourned in gratitude, celebrating the 54 years they'd had together, the life they'd built, the family they'd created. She lived 3 more years, surrounded by people who loved her, still teaching and still singing until the end. When she died in 1938 at the age of 79, she was buried next to Elijah on a hill overlooking their ranch, where they could watch the sunsets forever. On their shared headstone, their children had inscribed the words. They sang through the storms together and built a legacy of love. The Zimmerman ranch continued through the generations, and so did the tradition of singing through storms. Great-great-grandchildren who never met Elijah and Tessa knew their story, knew about the abandoned homestead, and the hymns and the love that had started with a cowboy hearing a frightened girl singing to calm her fears. And when storms came, as they always did, the Zimmermans gathered together and sang, keeping alive the tradition that had started more than a century before, in a time when the West was still wild and 2 strangers found each other in the shelter of song and storm.